The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan has long been a turbulent one. Lately, following President Joe Biden's reference to Pakistan as one of the most dangerous nations in the world, relations have deteriorated. But is a new momentum developing between Islamabad and Washington, born of geopolitical necessity? To discuss these and related issues, join the Democracy Forum's live debate, bringing your questions and opinions for our panel of experts. The event will broadcast live on all social media platforms of the Democracy Forum, on Wednesday, December 7, 2022, 2 to 4 p.m. UK time.
And welcome wherever you are in the world to our December Democracy Forum debate on a tangled issue that has exercised strategic and foreign policy minds for decades. US-Pakistan tensions. What next for erstwhile allies? Indeed, what next? And why has the Pakistan-American relationship been such a rough and tumble ride filled with U-turns and somersaults? The US chose Pakistan against India in 1971, pushing Delhi into the Cold War arms of Moscow. We're feeling that today. Pakistani leaders, though, were the first to put out feelers for Richard Nixon's historic visit to China. Yet Pakistan supports much of the very Islamic extremism that America has been fighting in the war on terror, and elements within its fragmented institutions gave sanctuary to America's number one enemy, Osama bin Laden. And then there's Afghanistan, and then there's Pakistan's nuclear weapons. You need a flowchart to untangle it all, and to help us, we have a really superb panel. Wajid, Syed, Ayesha, Siddiqa, Pervez, Hoodbhoy, Mariam, Mufti, and Julian, Spencer-Churchill. Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner, currently I'm told on a plane to a biodiversity conference in Canada, will give us a video address at the end. And as always, we go to the President of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the canvas and the background of our discussion. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Democracy Forum, which has been called to examine the nature of the relationship between Pakistan and the United States. Judging by the number of diplomatic encounters between Islamabad and Washington in recent weeks, it appears that the important issues affecting this alignment have resurfaced. And I commend the Forum for tracking these developments and for arranging for such an eminent panel of speakers to participate. We're very grateful for their attendance and we look forward to their contributions. And on your behalf, I'd like to acknowledge the role that Humphrey Hawksley has played throughout the year moderating this webinar series. I'm delighted he's able to chair the proceedings today. Since the collapse of the administration of Imran Khan in April, following a vote of no confidence, and the assumption of a coalition government led by Shehbaz Sharif, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity. In July, after an absence of 4 years, Washington finally replaced its ambassador in Islamabad. And during the last couple of months, the Biden administration has hosted several high-level missions involving senior military personnel and the foreign minister, Bhutto Zardari, whose visit coincided with the announcement of a $450 million grant to refurbish the Pakistan Air Force's component of F-16 fighter jets. The increasing visibility of Pakistan government officials in Washington has also been reflected in the strategic sphere, where the 75th anniversary of the start of US-Pakistan relations in 1947 has been put under the microscope. At a seminal meeting of the Atlantic Council last month, which focused on the future of the relationship, Fred Kemp, president of the council, referred to the past 30 years as a roller coaster ride. His comments were politely deflected by Pakistan's ambassador in Washington, Ali Masood Khan, who was keen to predict a new era, I quote, where Pak-US relations have been dehyphenated from Afghanistan, dehyphenated from India, not AfPak, not Indo-Pak, but Pak-US or US-Pak. We've been assured, he said, that even China would not be a new hyphen, a new prism for Pakistan in Washington. Despite these diplomatic overtures, however, the recalibration of relations is unlikely to be a straightforward process. It was unfortunate timing for Mr. Zardari that his visit to Washington coincided with a visit from the Indian Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jaishankar, who wasted no time in publicly lambasting the F-16 deal and criticizing Washington's alignment with Islamabad, as I quote, a relationship that has neither ended up serving Pakistan well nor serving American interests. In seeking to allay concerns in New Delhi and Islamabad that the United States views its ties with India and Pakistan primarily in relation to each other, it seems that Jayashankar's comments were well heeded. The following day, a State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, sought to clear the air. These are both partners of ours with different points of emphasis in each, he said. And within a fortnight of Bhutto Zardari's meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, President Biden let slip at a Democrat Party fundraiser in California that, I quote, what I think is maybe one of the most dangerous nations in the world, Pakistan, adding for good measure, nuclear weapons without any cohesion. Evidently, a visit to Washington in early October by the outgoing head of the Pakistan Army, General Bajwa, appears to have given Mr. Biden no reassurance about Pakistan's stability. Indeed, General Bajwa's replacement, General Munir, inherits much unfinished business as he contemplates the balancing act of seeking an improved relationship with the United States on the one hand and engaging China on the other, which will pose a significant challenge to the US Indo-Pacific strategy and add to US-Pakistan relations. Thus, the suspicion remains that Pakistan's relations with Washington are anything but stable and are likely to become a touchstone of the general election in April next year. Interviewed in hospital by the Financial Times last month, where he was recovering from an assassination attempt, Imran Khan acknowledged that Pakistan needs good relations with the United States, but he couldn't resist adding retrospectively, I quote, our relationship has been a master-servant relationship or a master-slave relationship, and we've been used like a hired gun. As the Wall Street Journal observed, I quote, in a land steeped in anti-American sentiment, such rhetoric plays well. Khan's supporters trumpet his implausible claim that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif leads an imported government put in place by scheming American diplomats. In an attempt to move beyond such pejorative language, however, Pakistan's ambassador to Washington, Ali Masood Khan, spoke recently that his country, I quote, cannot be stereotyped, nor the United States reduced to facile generalizations. Here, we need to employ the tool of public diplomacy to dispel misconceptions and misgivings. And the seasoned commentator Syed Ali observes, I quote, US policymakers should adopt a Pakistan strategy that transcends the need to forge a personal rapport with individual rulers and instead creates a more durable basis for bilateral engagement. He adds, the current moment offers an opportunity to rethink and reset this long-standing troubled relationship. The United States government's willingness to invest in such possibilities could help repair its tarnished image in Pakistan. Well, thank you very much for your attendance today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for that. One of the most dangerous places in the world. The suspicion remains that Pakistan's relations with Washington are anything but stable. As Charles says, please ask questions, send in comments. I like this early succinct one from Prashant Kumar. Can the US secure an insecure state? Don't answer it now, but let's think about it as we keep talking. Opening our debate from Washington, D.C., which is the right place to be, we have Wajid Syed, the US correspondent for the Pakistan television channel GOTV and the correspondent for the English language broadsheet, The News. He is going to outline for us the Pakistan-American relationship in recent years, bringing it up to what exactly is happening now, and of course, how does Washington see Pakistan? Wajid Syed, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Humphrey, and thank you for having me here. I must say that it's an honor to share this space with this illustrious panel. I'm going to briefly talk about the US perspective and its interest in keeping its relationship with Pakistan the way it is now transforming. I say transforming because we know that traditionally Pakistan-US relations have been transactional, a sort of a patron-client relation where Pakistan always boasted and then undoubtedly took advantage of its location. But if you look at the bigger picture, it was always seen through the prism of another country, like the term AFPAC. The idea being, if you want to achieve anything in Afghanistan, you have to go through Pakistan. There was hardly any one-on-one relationship otherwise, even though there were opportunities during the course when the United States worked up to build and expand bilateral ties with Pakistan, to buck up the civilian government, to encourage democratic values. But that backfired mainly because of Pakistan's own internal political imbalances and infighting for power. Not to mention the heightened anti-Americanism. For instance, some 12, 13 years ago, the Obama administration introduced the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill to support Pakistan and have stronger bilateral ties. It offered $1.55 billion per year. That bill was originally the Kerry-Lugar-Biden Act, but the name was changed as Biden became the vice president. So Biden has known Pakistan as long as he has been in Congress. Now, as president, his administration's attitude and outlook towards Pakistan reflects that as well. The second instance came when Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan and subsequently taken out by the US SEALs. This proof of betrayal angered the US, and I think in some quarters it still exists. I'm mentioning this because there's an institutional memory in play here. Memory of high cooperation. Pakistan had thought that since it helped the US fight the Soviets in the past, it would be treated the same way again. But the double dealing further strained the relations. We must realize that most of the US soldiers fighting in Afghanistan by the end of the war had not witnessed the 9/11 incident, let alone knowing how Pakistan once was a frontline state in the 80s. What they saw was that the people they were fighting were getting protection from across the border. This is the new institutional memory here. That's why in January 2017, the first tweet from the then President-elect Donald Trump against Pakistan further downgraded the ties. As we know, Trump accused Pakistan once again of lying and deceiving the US while receiving billions of dollars in foreign aid. He blocked all kinds of US financial and military assistance to Pakistan, and most of which is still in place. Since Obama, there were efforts to divert US attention towards China. President Trump henceforth pushed out the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is being taken forward by the current administration. And to fully focus on this developing situation, they wanted to leave Afghanistan behind, and this time with less dependence on Pakistan. After the withdrawal statements from the military and political leadership in Pakistan, like the then Prime Minister saying that the Taliban have broken the shackles of slavery, didn't help much, as we know that the US, without any boots on the ground, targeted and killed Ayman al-Zawahiri this year. So there was clarity that they don't want to depend on Pakistan as they used to. I remember that after the botched US withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mike Milley, told the US Congress when he was asked what he was most concerned about at the time, he said, one, to evacuate safely, and second, the security of Pakistan's nuclear assets. That, I think, is quite telling. Then there's another significant aspect, Pakistan's internal instability and its economic woes. The country's exploding population growth, food insecurity, limited health and education priorities, and diminishing skilled labor available, coupled with the political and religious divide, is a grave concern here. Precisely for the reason President Biden called Pakistan one of the most dangerous nations in the world just a couple of weeks ago, as it has already been mentioned here. His exact words were nuclear weapons without cohesion. That was not an off-the-cuff remark. The relationship has gone from mistrust to total distrust to now finding a way to work together to deal with issues of mutual concern. The US provided humanitarian assistance during the pandemic and quite recently aid to help with the flood victims. But for other critical and geopolitical matters, it is relying and supporting other countries in the region, especially India. Like as we are speaking, Special Representative for Afghanistan, Thomas West, is consulting with US partners regarding the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan. And for that, he's touring India, Japan, and the UAE. Pakistan clearly is not prioritized, and there are no huge expectations from it, as were in the past. They're involving other stakeholders than totally depending on Pakistan. Now, it's not that Pakistan has lost its geographic importance. It is a tough neighborhood, and we should consider the regional repositioning too. In the escalating conflicts with China, which Pakistan considers as its all-weather friend, the US is propping up India, which Pakistan considers as its arch-rival. So it's not all out neglecting Pakistan either, but the South Asian part of the Indo-Pacific strategy includes every country in the region except Pakistan. Neither friends nor frenemies sort of situation. The US also understands that Pakistan is vulnerable to terrorism. It still repeatedly calls Pakistan as its strategic partner. It has helped Pakistan secure loans from various financial institutions, given that there's also perception that Pakistan could even default in the near future. Then getting Pakistan out of the FATF grey list. From the looks of it, the US needs to stay engaged with Pakistan, but at a normal, as needed level by keeping the pace slow and steady. Perhaps that's why, after a couple of years, Islamabad has a proper American ambassador too. So my understanding is that the relationship between the US and Pakistan is in the correction mode right now, if you will. And it's probably going to stay here for the time being, at least, not more, or maybe not less. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. A fascinating thing that sparks a couple of questions, and one from the audience, Philip Bowman, which I'll put in a minute. But the discovery of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, which is the city of Pakistan's military college, was a huge change to that relationship. Has the US identified who in Pakistan's establishment was actually protecting bin Laden? And is that a factor in their thinking forward?
There are a number of stories about it out there already. I also did a story. But I think it's sort of right now is still a state secret. There's no official statement from either Pakistan or from the United States, or for that matter, the State Department. But the thing is, the stories that have come out is that there were people from the army that were retired, that were running private security establishments inside Pakistan, were involved in that, and some of them have been moved to first to Dubai and then to the United States. So there are these little indicators there. There are people who were involved whose faces are known, but there's no official response from either side.
Right, so they're both keeping stum on that, but just that was 11 years ago now.
Yeah.
That was a major sort of flip in the relationship. Could you list the ones since then that have, the sort of stages in the relationship since then?
I think not much has happened since then, because as I mentioned, the distrust was so deep that even though when the United States tried to talk with Pakistan or to have a proper relationship, there was this mistrust that always comes in. So that memory, that institutional memory, still exists, even though, as you mentioned, that it was 10 years ago, almost a decade ago. There were new people in the administration, in the bureaucracy, in the army as well, in the leadership role as well. But the institutional memory still exists. Is that this is what Pakistan did. So relating it with the past that Pakistan once helped the United States, or now betrayed Pakistan, might be coming down, but it still exists there. And this is, I guess, since then is the first time that now the United States, as I said, not friends but neither frenemies. So now they want to have a relationship that is not dependent on Pakistan at all, and leaving Pakistan behind and then moving forward. The one thing I think during this process that happened is that the political leadership that came out, and the anti-Americanism that they try to keep up, or keep it firing up, did also damage Pakistan's image as well. So even though it's not a one-on-one relationship as in political relationship, they don't consider as a political leader voicing the states or the countries or the people's voice, but they still want to engage, but they do not want to get insulted as well. I mean, this is I think very natural. So all the help that comes out, that even though the President Trump was very angry about Pakistan's whatever had happened throughout the past 10 years, whatever he did say later comes down, and he did meet with the Prime Minister. He praised the Prime Minister, right. But then nothing moved. There was no restoration of any security or any military assistance or any other aid that Pakistan was getting.
Which brings me to Philip Bowman's question. If you could answer it briefly, you've sort of answered it, but although the US-Pakistan relationship has been mutually beneficial, he says, has it ever been a real strategic partnership?
I think we need to define what real strategic partnership could be, because
could you define how you would see that? I mean, as the Pakistan correspondent in there, is it a real?
There were efforts to have that real strategic partnership. I mentioned in my brief statement as well that they were trying before Osama bin Laden was found there. Even before that, the Kerry Lugar bill was that real effort to have Pakistan on the US side, and there was no objection to Pakistan's relationship with China as well. But what did happen later on, and what is happening right now, is while they are in the correction mode, as I call it, they are still calling Pakistan as a strategic partner, but the level of intensity, the importance that Pakistan enjoyed before that has come down significantly. It's the minimum that you could do with another country, and that's how they're trying to keep it.
Okay, a minimum strategic partnership. We'll keep that thought with us. Thank you so much for the moment, but stick with us because we have questions coming in, and we're now going to Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, Senior Fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, author of 2 books, including internationally acclaimed Military Inc. She has also written numerous and published widely in Europe, North America, and South Asia. The only woman and civilian to work with the Pakistani Navy as Director of Naval Research, and also been an advisor to the chairman of National Accountability Bureau, and that's Pakistan's anti-corruption watchdog. Not surprisingly, she is going to be speaking to us about Pakistan's security relations with the US. Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, tell us what you know.
Humphrey Hawksley, thank you for inviting me. For a second, I thought you had Wajid Ali Syed speak on my behalf as well, give my part of the presentation. Thanks so much to Democracy Forum for inviting me. I thought I'm going to speak about Pakistan-US relations, security relations, which is technically the only relationship with meaningful relationship with Pakistan and US has. Socially, politically, we are engaged, but really the only meaningful conversation that there is in Islamabad and in Washington regarding Pakistan or bilateral is military and national security. So from a point when at the end of Imran Khan's government, when everything, it very clearly seemed that Pakistan relationship with Pakistan was over. It was a very desperate situation. Imran Khan accusing United States of interfering and rest of it. And this was a very bad patch, definitely a very bad patch of the relationship. And definitely doesn't compare with where Pakistan has wanted relationship with the United States to be. I mean, one of the desires in the Pakistani military establishment has been to see Pakistan-US relationship almost on par with the kind of relationship the United States has had with Israel. So, become a permanent, and therefore, when you look at literature on Pakistan-US relationship, there is so much a reference to an ended marriage, a rough marriage. I mean, those references are very interesting. But what I'm going to argue is that what we saw as a bad patch is really reassessment of the security relationship going back to 2012, when United States started to reassess. I mean, this is before United States stepped out of Afghanistan, but there was already a discussion. I mean, this famous in Washington about pivoting towards Indo-Pacific. So, and the famous book by Kurt Campbell by the title Pivot, in which there was this whole discussion of where Indo-Pacific had to become important. So very clearly, there was a reassessment in Washington of where, how United States would position itself. There was too much of, there was more than a decade long emphasis on non-state actors, terrorism and security, but United States was shifting towards state actors, more importantly, China. And what we see, for example, is that the national strategy, American National Strategy 2022, puts China way up, as its core threat. And therefore, any strategy, regarding in South Asia is also driven by this primary factor. But 2012 is when, in the United States, things started to, a reconsideration happened. Now, my argument, before I explain more, is that there has been, from that point when a reassessment was happening, the tone of relationship did turn down on both sides. And a reassessment was happening in Washington, and therefore a reassessment was also happening in Pakistan. And so what we see is poor relations, but not necessarily linked with one leader or the other, but rethink that was happening within the GHQ as well. And so, much before Imran Khan, before Imran Khan took power in 2018, there was PMLN government, and we see GHQ General Bajwa PMLN government representatives of PMLN government like Khaja Asif or the defense minister Khurram Dastagir talking about enough is enough, that Pakistan is tired of doing more, of being expected to do more by the United States, and it wants to not, it's time to say no more to United States. In fact, that's the time, 2018, when the famous Bajwa Doctrine, we saw the famous Bajwa Doctrine talking about no more, to United States. So, Imran Khan may have said it very crudely that, no more, but much before that, the security establishment, that was the assessment. Now, reason, of course, for the bad patch was that Pakistan could see that in terms of a United States re-engagement with South Asia in a very different manner, focused mainly on China, Pakistan had little chance of being the frontline state. And then came Trump, Donald Trump, and there was this famous tweet by Donald Trump expressing frustration with Pakistan, which was, I would say, the high point of the bad patch of relationship between Pakistan and United States. But since then, there has been a gentle reassessment and resurgence of relationship, which is optimized by and depicted by the fact that very recently, not only has the US Congress allowed for the sale of, and let me kind of emphasize that it's not a grant or a loan, it's a sale, simply a sale of $450 million worth of spares for Pakistan's F-16s. Now, critically, the sale itself, in a way, emphasizes Pakistan's point that during Balakot, much against what Indian claim is that Pakistan lost that a Pakistani F-16 was shot down. The spare supply actually emphasizes Pakistan's point that an F-16 wasn't lost during that conflict. So indirectly, kind of it comes to United States comes to Pakistan's rescue. But what it really establishes, now there could be a number of reasons why a reassessment or resurgence is happening. One is, and the India factor is very much there, in the background, that given that India is trying to kind of maintain its more independent policy. It's despite the strategic relationship with the United States, despite the fact that United States in many ways is dependent on India. India is pivotal now, is a frontline state in South Asia for United States Indo-Pacific strategy. Yet, it is continuing to engage with Russia. So, in a way, it could be considered as some writers would argue, as a messaging to New Delhi that that United States itself could do balancing in South Asia. But I think there are four factors with the four drivers, and very quickly, if I could request Vinny to put up my first slide, I would argue that on these four factors, there are four drivers. There have been these four drivers of Pakistan-US relationship. Historically, it's Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been central, especially in the context of United States war against communism during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, until 9/11 and until the end of the Soviet Union. But Afghanistan has been very central. Then you have counterterrorism, then nuclear proliferation, and in China. But in all these four areas, there has been generally a reordering, a tactical, I would say, reorganization of goals by both United States and also by Pakistan, driven by needs on both sides. And so I would say that the relationship remains very transactional, but it's a transactional relationship in which United States has agreed not to kind of pay Pakistan the way it used to in the past, but very much on the basis of, whatever task is done, whatever activity is done, and you immediately pay and move on. Not really build a long-term not to have a long-term and a long-winded investment in Islamabad. So from the point of view of Afghanistan, where relationship was very, very bad, especially 2011, there was Salala attack in 2011. There was followed by the Abbottabad operation in 2011, and then withdrawal from Afghanistan, in which Pakistan's the divergence was Pakistan insisting that United States should kind of look at Taliban as an alternative. Although Pakistan has not recognized Taliban as the legal government, and it's held back, yet a lot of transaction with the Taliban or with Afghanistan, all the conversation with United States does is happening through Pakistan. The other thing where I think United States would remain engaged at this point, at this juncture, with Pakistan on Afghanistan is as it reevaluates its strategy. Recently, I was at the Herat Security Conference in Dushanbe, in which the only official presence was American. The American charge d'affaires at Doha was present there. And very clearly, it seems that as far as engagement with, there is going to be perhaps more activity in Afghanistan. There's going to be more turmoil. And in both cases, whether it's helping, the Northern Alliance members there, alternative or looking for an alternative to the Afghan Taliban, Pakistan remains critical. Again, on counter-terrorism, this is a relationship in which both Pakistan and United States seem engaged. There have been the bad patch. For example, in 2021, and I refer to the Umar Said Sheikh case, the terrorist who's seemingly allegedly involved in the murder of American journalist Daniel Pearl. So in 2021, when Supreme Court acquitted him, there was a spat between Washington and Pakistan. And as a result of that, again, he's not been freed and remains in jail. So that engagement and a bilateral engagement, because very recently, as a week ago, United States has put the TTP, which was Pakistan's really main concern as far as the security is concerned, in the list of terrorists that United States would watch over. So there is that cooperation happening. I would speak less about nuclear proliferation, because the one comment that Wajid Ali Syed spoke about it, and of course there is this comment by President Biden, and I think in some ways, in some respect, as far as security establishment, Pakistan's security establishment is concerned, Joe Biden's comment is very interesting, because that was a period, post Imran Khan, and in which one was not sure who was in charge of, or how military establishment was being governed. So from the perspective of nuclear proliferation, this is indeed critical. Now, finally and very quickly, let me also look at China, which has been, so from a point in post 2013, CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor today is a critical issue as far as United States is concerned. And United States government has often spoken about it, but this was certainly not the case prior to between 2013 and 2016. I mean, as far as I can remember, the conversation in Islamabad during that period, and in fact, I would take it back to 2006, when Chinese companies were being brought in to construct Gwadar port. There was very little objection from United States. there may have been conversations, but not as pointed an issue was made out of CPEC as you see it today. And at that time, one of the things that United States pointed out was United States was eager to leave Afghanistan, and China was seen as a country which was taking on not just Pakistan's financial burden, that responsibility, but also was useful in engaging Pakistan in terms of changing Islamabad's policy towards counterterrorism. There was a lot of skepticism that Pakistan couldn't continue to support terrorism or terrorists in one form or the other. Now, with CPEC, then came CPEC and greater American objection to it. But another shift that I see, and there you see a conversation in Pakistan tilt towards that Pakistan no longer believes in geopolitics but geoeconomics. Now, what it's doing is struggling to actually reposition itself and have a tactical divergence both from United States and from China as well. In fact, what we see is that General Bajwa visits to United States, and constantly, he was constantly after 2000, in fact 2018, there were a couple of visits to 2 to 3 visits that Bajwa did to United Kingdom, which had remained then a major window of conversation between Pakistan and United States, in which his message constantly was that, look, we are, and I'll quote from his speech that he delivered at IISS in London, that Pakistan is genetically tied to China, to the West, to United States. And if there is help provided, if there's money and weapons provided, they will not look towards China. So there was even a messaging to the West that Pakistan was ready for an abandonment. Now, let me go to my second slide, which is also what one needs to look at, that Pakistan's policy right now vis-a-vis China and United States is very driven by its main foreign policy and security framework, in which there are 2 major drivers: India, its economic needs, and its military needs. And so the reality is that today there is China, which is the source for providing weapons, major weapons, to all 3 services: the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army of Pakistan is today mainly Chinese. Yet its economic dependence remains the West and the United States, and therefore a relationship has to be juggled. The security relationship thus has to present that balancing, which now has been termed as geoeconomics, although I don't think that geoeconomics Pakistan presents that huge potential of doing that balancing. But as far as security relationship is concerned, that balancing is done through calling out or kind of with new tags like geoeconomics rather than geostrategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Ayesha Siddiqa, for that. I wondered if I could keep you for a moment, because we've got some questions coming in from Seng Hasnan Searing, which I think are up your street a bit. The first one is, does Pakistan see India's hand in recent Taliban attacks? Does it see India's hand? And the second one, if you could sort of wrap them together, senior Pakistan military officer sanctioned by the UN for helping Al-Qaeda and Taliban on chemical and biological nuclear weapons. This is this tangled web that we were talking about at the beginning. Any thoughts?
Sorry, can you repeat the second question?
The second one, a senior Pakistan military officer has been sanctioned by the UN historically for helping Al-Qaeda and Taliban on chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. I think this is a similar theme to the one that I asked earlier about, who was giving sanctuary to bin Laden, who is sanctioning this sort of action from Pakistan?
See, my response to the first question, where does Pakistan see, does Pakistan, does see India's hands in the recent
India's
Taliban
hand in recent Taliban attacks? Yeah.
Yes, of course, that is where TTP it believes is has many owners, and one of the owners is India. The other country which Pakistan does not because of its own security reason, does not name is Iran. There is that element of suspicion as far as Iran is concerned. But definitely India is considered as one of the threats. Now, as far as Pakistani military and Pakistan, now what I believe is that in case of Mr. Bashir, the nuclear scientist who went and spoke with Osama bin Laden, he was kept in 40 to 50 days of he was kept by the security agencies, interrogated, etc. Now, while Pakistan, there has been no report, and it's interesting that the son, his military career was never affected. And that leads to this other issue, which is that there has always been this suspicion in the United States vis-a-vis Pakistani military, that it has been on the side of supporting militants and supporting certain extremist groups in Afghanistan against
and nuclear proliferation as well, isn't it?
Again, well, in this case, we don't think that there was any evidence, and even United States didn't come up with an evidence that any know-how was passed on. And I think it's important to also appreciate that from a point in, I would say, pre 2007, 2007-8 is when Musharraf was still there, and in fact 2001 to 2007, and then that's first phase, and then later on, at that point in time, Pakistan military's understanding of nuclear proliferation was very different from how it evolved, and it very closely worked with the military establishment. Having caught, for example, Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan passing on nuclear secrets to Iran, to North Korea, to even Libya, where the understanding in the army was that this is a technology for sale or could be bartered. In case of North Korea, they took the Hori missiles, Nondong missiles, in return for nuclear weapons, nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment technology. That shift then happened, and very closely what we see is, for example, officers from Strategic Plans Division on a regular basis going to, for example, Stimson Center, where they work, research, learn, and so one saw a gradual increase in knowledge of how and perception of how nuclear deterrence takes place. And this is precisely the same kind of a behavior, let me very quickly refer to it, that we see during General Bajwa's time. So from a moment when in 2013, 17, 18, when General Bajwa thought enough is enough, I'm not going to do more, I do not need, there is American help, there is American, there was CPEC, there is economy, there is, I'm completely dependent on China, I do not need United States anymore. From that point onwards to maybe a couple of years ago, when the realization completely set into the GHQ that no, you had to take United States along. So a tactical balancing had to be done.
Okay, thank you. That's clarified a bit where we're going with this. There is this fragmentation of values, I think, which is partly where we're going now. Please stay around, because we're going to Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy now, a nuclear physicist, activist, and national security analyst, who's going to, I hope, shed some more light on this tangled web that we're in, with a distinguished track record in academia. And 10 years ago, Foreign Policy magazine included him among the 100 most influential of global thinkers. We're very lucky to have him, and he is now going to outline for us this growing mismatch between the two cultures, the Western liberal and the Pakistan Islamic, and the impact this has had on state-level relations. Pervez Hoodbhoy, tell us your conclusions.
Thank you, Humphrey. Before I begin, though, I'm tempted to answer the question that you asked of Ayesha, in particular about Bashiruddin Mahmud, because this is a guy that I got to know 45 years ago, and most recently encountered him some 4 years ago. The man is a crackpot. There's nothing to fear from him. If his son is like him, there's no danger of nuclear proliferation. He's a nuclear engineer, Bashiruddin Mahmud, who believes that the Lord created genies out of fire. He created you and me out of earth. And that if we catch the genies, then we can solve Pakistan's energy problems. So that was my fight with him 45 years ago. I don't think there is really much that he can contribute towards the building of anybody's bomb. Anyhow, let me come to the main issue that is before us, which is what is the state of US-Pakistan relations, what determines it, and what's next for erstwhile allies. Well, let me start from the assumption, it's rather an obvious fact, that when we speak of US-Pakistan relations, we must remember that these are principally those between the United States government and the Pakistan military. This goes back to the very early days of Pakistan, to the 1950s, and even before General Ayub Khan imposed martial law in 1958. Ayub Khan was a very frequent visitor to Washington. He was loved by the US administration. He was loved by Samuel P. Huntington, and this was the initiation of a very close relationship between the Pentagon, the US government, the US State Department, and the Pakistani military. This remained pretty much true all throughout the Cold War. As you know, we were members of the PACs, CETO and CENTO. There was a brief cooling off period during Bhutto's 5 years, but the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 brought the US and Pakistan together as never before. Now, in the intervening 4 decades, since 1979, much has happened. The Soviet Union fell apart in 91, Pakistan went nuclear in 1998, 9/11 happened in 2001, and then Kabul fell to the Taliban last year. Now, 4 decades later, it is still true that the Pakistan army runs Pakistan, and that Pakistan-US relations are essentially set by the army. But remember, this is a very different army from that which existed in the first 2 decades after partition. At that time, it had values which were essentially those of the Indian Army or of the British Royal Army. But now, it's sociologically different, it's culturally different, and this is what I'm going to spend some time talking about. Now, of course, the Pakistan Army retains its focus on India as a civilizational enemy. And it's the raison d'etre for the army, after all. This is what, having an enemy like this is what allows it to consume a disproportionate fraction of national resources. And of course, Ayesha has written a lot about this, and she's written about the middle business, as she calls it, and how it has swallowed up such a big chunk of the economy of national resources. Now, as a consequence of what happened during the Soviet invasion and the great jihad that was organized jointly by Pakistan, the United States, and Saudi Arabia, and of course the 11 years of General Zia-ul-Haq's rule, the army was made to change its values and became much more Islamic, and it began to conceive of itself as no longer just the defenders of the territorial integrity of Pakistan, but also the defender of the ideological borders. In fact, that became the slogan of the Pakistan Army, that we are the defenders of the ideological borders. What are they? Not very well defined, but Islam. And so they became more and more radicalized. Now, since we are speaking particularly about the relationship with the United States, we must ask, why did the Army's narrative on America change? I think there were two basic reasons. First, it became clear, and this was during the Clinton years, that the United States saw India as being far more important to its position in the world than Pakistan. And so Pakistan, which had conceived itself earlier as being equal in American eyes or higher because of its older links with America, it was grievously disappointed. Of course, it had sore disappointment in the 1965 war between India and Pakistan, when the United States did not come to Pakistan's help in the way that it had expected. However, in 1971, the United States did make some noises. It did send the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal, although it didn't do anything and steamed right out as the hostilities started. But it was heartened by the fact that President Nixon had taken Pakistan's side over India's. But then with the rise of India, it saw itself degraded in the eyes of the United States, and that created a reaction. The second reason was that the Army, after the defeat of after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, it saw that the US had essentially left the region, felt abandoned, and it is then that it conceived the idea of using the Mujahideen and the religious militants that had been trained during those years for foreign policy purposes. So to use those militants in Kashmir, where in 1987 the Indians had botched up the elections and created massive local resistance, and the hope was that these militants would also extend Pakistan's influence in Afghanistan, create for it what they hoped for would be strategic depth. And so that's when it started this very risky business of using extra state actors both in Kashmir and in Afghanistan. In the case of Kashmir, nuclear weapons would afford it protection from Indian retaliation, and that then took on its own dynamic. That led to the Kargil War, and of course Pakistan has now essentially ceased that. Two reasons. One is the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and the fencing of the border. However, what Pakistan found slipping outside of its control was the blowback, and that bloody civil war which took place between 2000, so just before 9/11, and 2021, the casualties from that have been something like 120,000 Pakistanis killed on both sides. And that's far more than the casualties in wars with India. We've had 4 wars with India, but if you add up all those casualties, it's just a fraction of this internal of the casualties in this war. Now, let me come to the issue of why this relationship is souring. And to my mind, it is within the army a rise of religiosity in the lower ranks. Not so much in the upper ranks perhaps, although certainly it is there, but Pakistan has bought into the nuclear paranoia, I would say, that America's sole interest in this region is to snatch Pakistan's nuclear weapons and to weaken Islam. And that is what the man on the street was made to believe in, and I'd say that they've been pretty successful in that. Imran Khan has capitalized precisely on this. He, when he was ousted in a no-confidence vote, he immediately pointed to America, saying that because of his firmness of commitment to Islam, he had been victimized. Because he had been speaking out so emphatically against Islamophobia, he was now he had now been shown the door, and that the government which is presently in place in Pakistan is an imported government. So that is the slogan. It's an imported government. I am the true indigenous pro-Pakistani son of the soil, and I am fighting against America's pernicious influence. Now, it's not just the United States which has been affected by this, I'd say, this huge swing to the right, to the religious right. It's also Europe. And so this was 2 years ago. There was a move by the TLP, Tehreek Labbaik Pakistan, who were earlier on a non-existent political party, but with the help of the army, they became actually the third biggest political party, or the fourth biggest political party in Pakistan. And their principal demand is to have the blasphemy, is to have the blasphemers punished. So when the incident happened in France of blasphemy, as they saw it, they demanded removal of the French ambassador. Imran Khan actually considered that, and you can see the pictures of him with the leaders, with the bearded leaders of the TLP sitting in his office. Eventually, of course, that turned out to be impractical. It would have destroyed Pakistan's foreign policy. He was persuaded to pull back on that. What is the future? Well, at the level of culture, anti-Americanism is going to take a long time to dissipate. It's there in the rank and file, it's there on the man on the street. It is so pervasive and it is so deep that sometimes I feel that maybe America is ahead of us, ahead of India, in terms of the level of vitriol that it draws, particularly in the Urdu press and on television. Will this change? Maybe, but I don't see this happening very soon. The reason that the Pakistani state is increasingly resorting to religion as its raison d'etre and increasingly emphasizing the two-nation theory as the basis of Pakistan is because it seems to be running out of options. And instead of damping down religious fervor, it is seeking to jack it up. Why do I say that? If you look at the school curriculum that was initiated by Imran Khan, well, it now contains more religious material than is contained in what is taught in madrasas. And it's an incredible amount. It has led to secular subjects like computer science not being taught in schools in Pakistan because they're learning the Quran most of the time. They're learning it in Arabic. They're learning the Arabic language. They're learning the translation. They're learning various prayers. They're learning also the hadith. And so the Pakistani child is being squeezed more and more, and that was Imran Khan's curriculum. The government that has succeeded it has in fact increased it, not decreased the religious content. So, at least in the short run, and by short run I mean for the next 30 years or so, I don't see that Pakistan is going to become a normal country. I feel that the path it has taken of increasing religiosity is going to have blowbacks in multiple places. The US-Pakistan relationship, the US-West relationship will be one, but in terms of the opening up to the Taliban in Afghanistan, that is far more dangerous, and it's happening. You see that the TTP is once again rising. It is not being suppressed by the army. In fact, the army has been arresting those Pakistani citizens who are terrified of the TTP and who have been protesting. They're the ones who are being put in jail, whereas the TTP, it's being argued one must negotiate with them. So, I'm sorry I'm going to end on this pessimistic note, but I think that these cultural factors are going to be just as important as the strategic factors, just as important as China, because ultimately it is the way that people think within a society that matters more than anything else. Thank you.
Pervez, Hoodbhoy, thank you so much for that. You mentioned, you used the word crackpot. I think it was to describe A.Q. Khan. I'm not sure, there was a bit of a muffle that was somebody else was a bit. I'm trying to think is that there's there's a lot of elements going on here, which seem to be sort of off-piste of government, off the book stuff. So you have the nuclear proliferation, you have the the sanctions of the chemical and biological and nuclear weapons, you have the ideological borders that you so skillfully said, the not well-defined ideological borders, that are all pushing things in one direction. How much of that is crackpot and how much of it is government thinking, and how much of it is, as you said, a society that thinks in a certain way?
Oh, I use the word crackpot for one individual, Bashiruddin Mahmood. He's the guy who had gone and met with Al-Qaeda and with Osama bin Laden way back in, I think, just before 9/11. He's not a danger. And as far as the spread of nuclear weapons goes, I think earlier fears about proliferation and that Pakistan would continue, they have proved to be false so far as I can see. A.Q. Khan is dead. In fact, he was pretty much out of the game after 2004.
Mm-hmm. Right. But just generally, in fact, there's a question, Nadeem Shah here says, what does the panel make of Pakistan's Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari's calls for the US and international community for full engagement with the Afghan Taliban? So this is something that goes diametrically and culturally against what the West's policy is at the moment. What's your view on that?
Well, of course, since they are Pakistan's neighbors, one must engage with them. One should engage with everybody. However, the Kabul government, the Taliban, are very ideological. They are not easily susceptible. In fact, they might not be susceptible at all to Pakistan's demand that the TTP be expelled, because they see the TTP as a continuation of their own selves. And so, although Pakistan has tried, it has failed in that regard. Sure, we should continue to engage, but the need is to now act militarily against the TTP. There should not be any negotiations. More negotiations gives them more space. It shows weakness. It shows that Pakistan lacks resolve. And the sooner we crack down on militants, the better. Because if we don't, they have more time to organize. Now, even more important is that we climb down the ladder of religiosity. Because ultimately, what is it that the TTP wants? It wants the imposition of Sharia. What is Pakistan's state ideology? That it wants Islam. And wanting Islam and wanting Sharia are not two separate, mutually distinct things. The more you emphasize religion, the more you will encourage terrorists like the TTP.
These are your ideological borders, I think, that you were talking about. I know you have to go shortly, so thank you so much for being with us. You'll miss our question and answer session at the end, but thank you very much, Pervez Hoodbhoy. We are now going on to Dr. Mariam Mufti, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Her research into a wide range of South Asian issues has resulted in many publications, of course, and two books. One coming out very soon, Accessing Political Power and Democratization in Pakistan, and one in 2020, Pakistan's Political Parties Surviving Between Dictatorship and Democracy. What a good title that is. She will now explain how the mistrust between the US and Pakistan arose, how domestic politics influences that, and the foreign policy, of course, and I hope offer ideas on how to end the recent tensions, not the 30 years that Pervez Hoodbhoy mentioned. Mariam Mufti, tell us what you know.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you. I have the challenging task of following three very esteemed co-panelists who've done an excellent job of outlining the challenges of the US-Pakistan relationship. So what I want to do in my 15 minutes is essentially offer a very, very short and quick summary of how I interpret this relationship and use it as a way to set up my own talk, which is to actually talk about how domestic politics has influenced foreign policy making in both the United States and Pakistan, and how that has a bearing on how scholars today are thinking about this relationship and thinking about possible ways to improve US-Pakistan tensions. So the first thing to understand, obviously, and this was outlined very clearly in Wajid's and Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa's presentations, is that there's tremendous mistrust between the United States and Pakistan, and this essentially stems from differing perspectives that each has of the other. Now, Pakistan's foreign policy has very much been motivated by India. Pakistan emerged as a security state, has always seen India as an antagonistic neighbor, and that state of insecurity has led Pakistan to focus mainly on India when creating its foreign policy. America, in the longer term view, of course, has been motivated by the containment of communism first throughout the Cold War. And then when, of course, Soviet Russia falls, it has now shifted its focus, and the focus is more so on China. Now, Pakistan has always thought, or has in more recent times, I would say, has started thinking of the United States as more of a fair weather ally, which is quite uniquely different from the way Pakistan perceives China, which is an all weather ally. Clearly, Pakistan perceives the United States to be an ally, yes, but certainly not someone who can be consistently relied upon. The United States thinks of Pakistan as wanting to pursue its own agenda, which very often runs counter to what the United States wants and hurts US interests. The current moment that we are in right now, ever since the global war on terror has ended and Pakistan's geostrategic importance to the United States has diminished, is a uniquely different one. Okay, there are a couple of things that we need to take into account. The first one, of course, is that there is a US-India entente. Okay, previously throughout the Cold War, during the time that Pakistan was the United States' most favored ally, the most important player in South Asian politics, America had very strange relations with India. That has changed. And I would say that change has happened more so 2005, 2008 on, ever since the United States signed the nuclear deal with India, and currently has upped the alliance with India, upgraded the alliance with India by also participating in the Quad, which is a security led alliance amongst the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. Again, to contain China. The second thing that is uniquely different about this moment is that Russia and Chinese geostrategic competition is changing the way South Asian countries are engaging with one another. Yes, India aspires to regional hegemony, but India is also very much checked by its neighbors when they use China as leverage against India. So that's one aspect of it. But the second aspect, which Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa mentioned, was Russia's presence, right? The fact that India is continuing to engage with Russia, that Russia is continuing to contribute to India's defense. So the United States is very much having to deal with the presence, the very concentrated presence of the Chinese and the Russians in the Indian subcontinent. The third thing I would say is that currently Pakistan is in a moment where it is facing some blowback from its unbalanced civil-military relations. And I will speak to this in just a second, but also blowback from its regional policy, which is that Pakistan is now facing tremendous threats in the form of religious extremism. And right now, ever since the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has withdrawn from so-called negotiated peace with Pakistan, well, I think Pakistan is in a very precarious position. So when you think about US-Pakistan relations, there is much to overcome in this relationship. Pakistan's foreign policy will always be India-centric. US-Pakistan views are not likely to align, and China will always be a sticking point. So I would like to recast all of this, though, by saying that the United States cannot make the strategic error of isolating or ignoring or marginalizing Pakistan. And the reason why I think that is important is for all of the security considerations that have been mentioned by my co-panelists preceding me. Now, there are 4 or 5 things that can be done in order to resuscitate this relationship and to make it better, which is perhaps to shift the focus on from security to perhaps engaging Pakistan in the non-security realm. And I think that if the United States and Pakistan were to find common ground, it would be specifically on boosting entrepreneurship, increasing ties on protecting the climate and climate change. Pakistan and the United States need to boost people-to-people interactions rather than government to military interactions or military to military interactions, which is what we've seen happen in the past. We now need to see the people-to-people interaction, which I think could resolve some of the cultural miscommunication that has happened between the two countries. And then, of course, in the realm of technology, America can support Pakistan technologically, and that Pakistan should not have to rely just on China for that kind of engagement. And finally, and this was mentioned by Dr. Siddiqa's presentation, which is that India, Pakistan, and America can find common ground on counterterrorism and perhaps even intelligence sharing. This, I think, is something that the United States could be the leader on, especially in South Asia. And I think the United States is trying to also signal to India that within South Asia, Pakistan is not India is not the only country that it's relying on, that perhaps it could resuscitate this relationship with Pakistan. And that brings me to my main point, which is that all of these things that I just mentioned, entrepreneurship, climate change, people-to-people, technology transfers, counterterrorism, and intelligence sharing, cannot happen without the United States having a better understanding of Pakistan's domestic politics and how Pakistan's domestic politics is influencing its foreign policy. And before I get started on this part of my talk, I just want to say that an Irish scholar by the name of James Rosnow identified 5 potential sources of domestic politics and how they can potentially have an impact on foreign policy. And so these 5 include, yes, the external environment, which we have talked a lot about already, societal environment, which Dr. Hoodbhoy talked about a fair bit in his presentation. I would like to speak about the governmental structure, the bureaucratic roles, and perhaps the personalities of individual actors in the way that foreign policy is being made by both countries. Let me start with the case of the United States first. Now, the formulation of foreign policy in Washington, D.C. has involved the competitive relationship between the institutions and the actors responsible for making foreign policy. First, foreign policy is derived from input of regional specialists who manage bilateral issues and those who handle functional issues such as democracy promotion, nuclear proliferation, narcotics control, etc. In a crisis, functionalists who address geostrategic interests come to dominate the policy process. In Pakistan's case, however, bilateral relations have been derivative of major strategic needs, containing Soviet expansion in Afghanistan and recently the US-led war on terror, as a result of which realities on the ground have often been distorted and neglected in the formation of policy. Institutionally, the US Department of State, which is the main repository of regional expertise outside the intelligence community, has been structurally ineffective in comparison to the Department of Defense and National Security Council in formulating foreign policy. Second aspect of this is that foreign policy has traditionally been understood to be the prerogative of the executive and the Congress playing a supportive role in the United States. Hence, American foreign policy towards Pakistan has long been analyzed as being dependent on an individual president's doctrine. However, the end of the Cold War and budgetary pressures on federal expenditures has brought foreign policy under scrutiny and allowed Congress to reassert itself. In Pakistan's case, which is one of the largest recipients, or has been historically, of US aid, this has meant that Congress is heavily involved in the authorization of foreign assistance. Now, when I mention the Congress, I should also point out that that U.S. foreign policy towards Pakistan is very deeply influenced by the lobbying groups in Washington D.C. And over the last 2 decades, I would say that the Indian lobby in Washington D.C. has been considerably stronger than the Pakistan lobby. This is a point that was mentioned by Wajid Syed in his presentation, where he was pointing out that the institutional memory of how U.S.-Pakistan relations are interpreted in the United States has actually significantly shifted, right? And this is partly the work of lobbying groups on Capitol Hill. The third point I would like to make is that beyond governmental and bureaucratic structures, the national character and value orientation of a country also has to be considered. Ironically, US policymakers, although keen to protect the values of liberalism in Pakistan, have overlooked the lack of democracy and protection of human rights so long as Pakistan has agreed to be a willing ally supporting US geostrategic interests in the region. Now, with respect to Pakistan, some aspects of domestic politics that have a bearing on foreign policy making, of course, include the unbalanced civil-military relations in Pakistan, where the military bureaucracy nexus has come to dominate foreign policy making in Pakistan, much to the chagrin of civilian elected political leaders. In fact, with respect to India and maybe even the United States, the military in Pakistan has been very, very protective of how Pakistan's foreign policy is projected around the world. Now, the timing of US assistance to Pakistan has significantly boosted the military's institutional power and prestige within Pakistan and played an important role in shaping the military's professional and political profile in the polity, as well as increasing its legitimacy. Now, I'm going to give you a historical example, but US economic aid helped General Ayub Khan in the 1960s boost Pakistan's GDP and attract much needed foreign direct investment, and similarly helped General Pervez Musharraf solve Pakistan's economic problems in the early 2000s. These economic initiatives enhanced popular support for these regimes. The second aspect of this is that the United States has helped the Pakistani military substantially enhance its capacity and expertise. It was able to advance and replicate the training it received in fighting America's proxy war in Afghanistan again, and then later against India and Kashmir. And the exploitation of India as an existential threat and the waging of a jihad against it has served to augment the military's image as martyrs, willing to sacrifice themselves in the name of Pakistan's territorial integrity and Islamic ideology. The acquisition of modern technology and organizational skills through direct military-to-military transfers from the United States have inadvertently pitted a confident military against political institutions in the domestic context. Third, and perhaps the most significant, is that the long-term flow of economic and military assistance has made Pakistan aid-dependent, undermined democratic accountability, and slowed down institutional development. Successive Pakistani governments, whether civilian or military-led, have betted on the country's critical geostrategic location and its nuclear status that the international community will rescue it in times of economic distress. Starting from the 1980s, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund financing have helped to plug fiscal deficits and debt burdens. In return, the IMF has tied strict conditionalities and austerity measures to aid, which instead of being tailored to Pakistan's unique socio-political context, have met the needs and incentives of external donors. Certainly, US endorsement of these bailouts in line with its national security agenda has reinforced the perception of Pakistan's geostrategic importance and disincentivized the ruling elite from developing sustainable economic institutions that foster growth. Now, since the end of the war on terror and Pakistan's reduced importance to US national security, Pakistan has increasingly turned to authoritarian states such as China and Saudi Arabia for economic aid. Pakistan has recently signed a $2.3 billion loan facility agreement with China and received a $3 billion loan from Saudi Arabia to help its cash-strapped economy in the wake of depleting foreign exchange reserves. These, of course, are short-term fixes to keep the country economically afloat, but in the long term, the consequences are devastating. For one, Pakistan is caught in a debt trap and deeply dependent on two authoritarian states for survival. China is Pakistan's largest arms supplier, while Saudi Arabia is its largest petroleum supplier. Doing business with these states with their own nefarious foreign policies limits Pakistan's agency and ability to have relations with Western democracies. Now, moving on, my next point regarding domestic politics is the relationship of the Pakistani elite and the Pakistani masses, the so-called man on the street that Dr. Hoodbhoy referred to, towards the United States. One of the things that I will say about the Pakistani elite, and this has been documented widely in the literature, even by writers such as Dennis Cooks, ex-US ambassador to Pakistan, is that the elite in Pakistan, including the military, the bureaucracy, and also your land-owning rural elite and urban political elite, all have American connections and would like to continue to sustain these American connections. This is an English-speaking elite, and this is an elite that is very deeply interested in sending its progeny to educational institutions in the United States to better understand these Western liberal values and to bring them back to Pakistan. Furthermore, I would say that political and state elites in Pakistan are very deeply interested in maintaining the official and commercial linkages that it has towards the United States. This must be contrasted with the masses in Pakistan, which is that the masses in Pakistan, who are not necessarily consumers of English media or consumers of English newspapers and are reading the much more hardline US Urdu language press in Pakistan, do not necessarily have that same confidence in the United States of America. In fact, many of them would consider the United States as being unfriendly and hostile towards Pakistan and Islam. And this is something that we have seen happen in the 2018 electoral campaign that was led by ex-Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan. And currently, Imran Khan, who is mobilizing the masses currently in order to demand a new election, is similarly making the same kinds of appeals. Now, I do want to end with one last point, which is about how the political elite in Pakistan, how the politicians in Pakistan are in fact responding to the United States. On the one hand, you have Imran Khan, who has, merely days before his no confidence vote, while he was trying to shore up his crumbling coalition, Imran Khan played his trump card. And his trump card claimed that members of the opposition were conspiring with a foreign entity to oust him from office. As evidence, he furnished a letter that threatened severe consequences for Pakistan if the no confidence motion failed. We have since learned that a cable sent by outgoing Pakistani ambassador to the United States recounted a conversation with senior level US State Department officials that led Khan to conclude that US-led regime change was afoot. Now, this is extremely important. This is interesting how the United States of America is being invoked in a completely domestic political issue and regime transition in Pakistan. Imran Khan was ousted as part of this no confidence motion. And this trump card that he played obviously did not work. But what it required was for the Pakistani military to patch up the consequences of Imran Khan's so-called folly. And so we saw General Bajwa go on a visit to Washington, D.C. To mend relations. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that there is very little room for even Pakistani politicians to maneuver when it comes to this foreign policy thinking. And in fact, I would say that if you were to do an investigation of party manifestos prior to elections in Pakistan, you would find very little mention of foreign policy in these manifestos. And what little has been mentioned has very much been the establishment's view of how Pakistan's foreign policy ought to be made and conducted. And so with that, I will conclude my presentation to say that, the challenges that we think of the US between the United States and Pakistan certainly are determined by security on the one hand and by culture on the other, but we must also take into account the domestic politics of how foreign policy is being made in both countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. It was so fascinating. We're running a little bit over time now, but I just want to plant with the panel generally and yourself questions that I want to come to at the end of Dr. Julian Spencer-Churchill's. I want to ask actually how many of you agree with Pervez Hoodbhoy's view that 30 years of growing anti-Americanism is coming. That's the domestic politics feeding in that you mentioned there. And there's a couple of questions about the relationships with the big powers from Sunil Goring and Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore. What message might Washington's rapprochement with Islamabad send to India and China? Let's have a think about that. And China and Pakistan's relationship. Is that something the US needs to be wary of going forward? That's Sunil Goring's question there. We're going to return to them, but what I'm really looking for is really succinct answers, 1 or 2 words when we come up to sum everything up. We are now going to our last panelist, Dr. Julian Spencer-Churchill, Associate Professor of Political Science at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and Director of the Canadian Centre for Strategic Studies. He has written extensively on Pakistan and will unfold for us his view of the American pivot towards Asia, or the Indo-Pacific as it's now more generally called, and how Pakistan is actually one of those more stable pivot points in the region. Julian Spencer-Churchill, give us your argument.
Thank you, Humphrey. I'd like to thank the Democracy Forum for inviting me. So the current focus among American national security analysts is the possibility of a Taiwan war, and whether it manifests itself as an amphibious attack or bombardment by China of Taiwan or a blockade. Unlike the conflict in Ukraine, it's expected that the U.S. would act very promptly. At the present, most of the thinking is that the U.S. is not going to wait even 24 hours to interdict or to possibly even strike amphibious assets that China would be sending towards Taiwan. So this is really the big question, is what is Pakistan going to do in the event of a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan in one of those 3 contingencies: amphibious attack, blockade, or bombardment. And China's got a number of allies, of which Pakistan is one of them. There's Myanmar, which is largely dependent, bandwagoning on the Chinese state in order to maintain its essentially non-democratic military government. We see now North Korea acting very provocatively to South Korea, and there's a number of theories why, but one of the principal ones is Pyongyang thinks it's acting on behalf of China, which is ramping up its anti-US position on the Asian littoral. And this is peculiar because, in sort of a commonsensical way, it's actually provoking South Korea and Japan to move closer to the U.S. position on Taiwan. South Korean Marines even jointly exercised with Taiwanese Marines in the South China Sea. Pakistan's not done anything like this. And so this is, for the U.S., a very good sign. It seems to be taking a very neutralist position. And so this is something that we need to explain. What the U.S. essentially wants to know is what Pakistan is going to do in the opening hours and the opening weeks of a conflict with Taiwan, particularly since Pakistan hosts the Gwadar port and the Karakoram Highway, which is an energy link to the Persian Gulf. So the general consensus at the moment is that the Karakoram Highway is very narrow and wouldn't make more than a single-digit percentage advantage to importing energy. China would have to largely depend on oil brought in from its ally Russia in the contingency of a conflict over Taiwan. But it does look like China is setting Pakistan up as essentially to break a blockade that the U.S. Navy is expected to impose on Chinese commerce immediately after one of the 3 Chinese contingencies against Taiwan. Obviously, geography has a major role to play. It would be very difficult for the U.S. Navy to blockade Pakistan, given that both Saudi Arabia and Iran either have friendly relations or are trying to play a neutralist position between Washington and Beijing. So we have here what's expected to be an immediate onset of conflict and a need to determine what Islamabad's position is going to be. Now, one of the differences between the war in Ukraine and the war over Taiwan, of course, is that NATO is very reluctant to escalate because of the very large nuclear arsenal and the full spectrum capability that the Russians have for deploying tactical nuclear weapons. China's arsenal isn't quite at that level, but it is expected that China is building up its arsenal to about 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035, and then it's going to use it as some sort of shield to attempt to coerce the U.S. From escalating its intervention on behalf of Taiwan. So the principal lesson of the Ukraine war is that neutrals matter in much the same way as they did at the beginning of World War I and World War II. Neutral Holland, for example, in the First World War, imported American cotton, which was then re-exported to Germany, which was an important ingredient in explosives. And there was really nothing the British Navy could do to stop American commerce. And we're going to see the same thing in the contingency of Taiwan. And to put it in perspective, during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, you had about 2.3 billion people in the world. And today it's 8 billion. So in some ways, the Cold War with the Soviet Union, although the weapon levels were much higher, the scale of the economies today and the population levels today in a U.S.-China confrontation are much higher. And Pakistan's population is much greater than it was during the Cold War. And so the U.S. Has a much bigger challenge. This is not a bipolar environment. The conflict over Taiwan would be within a multipolar environment. And the U.S. has to have agile diplomacy. And so the U.S. is very interested in what Pakistan is going to do. Now, generally, the perception, most of the world, is that the Ukraine war is a European civil war, and most countries want to be neutral. There is a general revolutionary democracy that's being encouraged by the liberal foreign policies of the West. Pakistan is immune to this because it is a mature democracy for its relative level of its per capita income, and it's a part of the West's general strategy. It's passive at the moment of splitting Russia from China, and even trying to split China from its own government, as we see with the recent demonstrations in China. Now, the U.S. has an ongoing interest in having Pakistan help the U.S. supervise terrorism in Pakistan, but it's nominally an important policy in Washington. But in terms of the amount of money invested in it, it's not on the scale of trying to manage China. The U.S. did put pressure on Imran Khan to recognize Israel, which didn't go anywhere. However, the reason the failure in Afghanistan is not a major determinant of American policy on Pakistan is that Pakistan knows well that the West was divided over policy in Afghanistan between those who were seeking a revenge policy against the Taliban for providing sanctuary, and those who were pursuing a developmental strategy where we saw a huge amount of kleptocracy, billions of dollars of aid misspent that ultimately resulted in the failure of NATO's policy in Kabul. Some blame Pakistan, but most analysts blame Western foreign policy. And the European support was largely driven by perceptions of immigration, and changes in elections on the basis of immigration changed which European states participated in the coalition with the US in Afghanistan. So the conventional wisdom is that Pakistan is unstable and it's economically vulnerable. But actually, most of the analysts I've spoken to, and this includes organizations in Coronado Island, have a fairly sophisticated appreciation that bin Laden and AQ Khan are essentially manifestations of Pakistan's nationalism and the need to assert itself in Afghanistan, which is a very important source of depth. In the 65 and 71 wars, Afghanistan provided airfields and was a thoroughfare for supplies to Pakistan. So the perception of Pakistan, as my colleagues have mentioned, is determined to some extent by persistent pro-India bias in Washington and sort of a nascent pro-Israel worry about nuclear proliferation to other Muslim countries in the Middle East. But it's a distortion because among most of the institutional bureaucratic players like the Pentagon and the State Department, there's been a persistent recognition of the stability of Pakistan. If you are going to look at the level of terrorism within Pakistan, you have to compare it to Mexico, for example, particularly from 2000 to 2010, before Pakistan engaged in large-scale operations in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. What we see here is an imperial state that faces many of the same challenges as Turkey. So if you're going to look at instability in Balochistan, you really have to compare Pakistan's level of stability to Iran. And they're comparable in that there are serious governance issues, but this is in the periphery of the state and nowhere threatening the stability of the Punjab, and the Sindh, which is the core of the Pakistani state. What we actually have is a very competent foreign policy organization within Pakistan that's able to balance off the U.S., China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And very few countries are able to do this. I mean, if you're a large power like the U.S., you can play off against the Arab-Israeli dispute or deal with Japan and Korea. China deals with both Koreas and Saudi and Iran. Most countries, like Hungary, do very poorly balancing off common adversaries. Pakistan can do this because it's got a very strong bureaucracy that allows it to maintain a stable policy over a very long time. It's in fact remarkable that Pakistan's avoided the opprobrium that the U.S. has put on Iran and Venezuela, given that it's behaved quite aggressively in its region and it has nuclear weapons. And ideologically, I mean, at least in terms of political Islam, it's quite divergent from U.S. interests. So it's a puzzle. And how does it do it? It does it because it's got sufficient bureaucratic stability that it actually exerts as much influence, not as much influence in terms of close policy coordination, but in terms of access to key technologies. It has similar influence to Taiwan. I mean, they receive similar levels of technology support from the U.S. U.S. recently provided a $450 million upgrade and maintenance to the Pakistani F-16 Air Force. So, how is Pakistan able to do this? Well, it's got a relatively mature civilian democratic liberal elite. But key is the military. The military provides an anti-populist bureaucratic arm with, the net result is that Pakistan's got fewer religious parties or religious parties with less influence than in Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey, other key U.S. allies. And it's this independence of the military institution is maintained largely because they don't support conscription policies, which they would see as undermining the influence the independent influence of the military. Pakistan is relatively moderate in its foreign policy. If you see Pakistan's reaction to India's accidental launch of a missile, in most other regions, it would have led to immediate volatility. But Pakistan handled it through essentially direct and calm diplomatic procedures. Now, in the Ukraine war, Pakistan was initially neutral, as manifested by the UN votes. But by August, it had begun to switch to the US bloc, largely through the links it has with the US. It's been providing 122 millimeter artillery shells to the Ukrainian military through flights into Romania and Bulgaria, and so it's tilted in a way that's fairly dramatic, showing that it's not in a neutral position, and it's doing this against a major Chinese ally, and there's not much China can do about it. Now, the essential reason Pakistan does this is it has a sense of betrayal that China's public calls for a neutralist position over Kashmir has led Pakistan to adopt a reciprocal neutralist position over Taiwan, where Pakistan has stated publicly China and Taiwan must resolve their issues over Taiwan according to the UN Charter. Now, why is the U.S. cooperating with Pakistan? I mean, this is infuriating for India, and it's one of the reasons that India has delayed turning the Quad into an alliance. I mean, they keep repeating to Washington $450 million to support an F-16. The Washington has reiterated that this F-16 would never be used against India, but of course it's primarily designed as a nuclear weapons delivery system into India. And India's got a similar deja vu with the M48 tank from the 1960s. So the US is bearing the cost of India's fury, primarily because it doesn't trust India. India's revocation of Articles 370 and 35A over Kashmir's autonomy, the fact that you have sectarian politics right now pervading the BJP party in India, which is alienating not only Muslim country allies of the US, but also energy providers to India. And just the very broad US principle of never allowing a regional hegemon to consolidate, which means Pakistan is going to be a long-term investment by the US. The US needs Pakistan for the future, long after China ceases to be a threat. So there's a long-term policy there. What does Pakistan get? Pakistan gets access to the US market. The US is the largest export market. The US backs the IMF, which provides easier debt relief than China, which demands collateral. And so it manifests itself in relations even between Pakistan and Taiwan. Taiwan's exports to Pakistan are about half of US exports to Pakistan. There's a very high level relationship there. Taiwan is seeking to get access to and develop and invest in Pakistan's computer industry in Lahore, particularly software and computer assembly. So essentially the net conclusion is that in a coming conflict between China and the US over Taiwan, Pakistan is not going to act like an agent of Beijing in the way that Pyongyang in North Korea thinks it's currently doing. And it's going to remain probably an ally leaning towards Washington. And this is crucial because it is going to simplify the US naval blockade of China in the contingency of a China attack on Taiwan. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, that is a fascinating element there. And we're now going to go very shortly to Barry Gardiner, the chair of Democracy Forum. And I just want the panel to think about one of the things that came to my mind there is that anti-Americanism that Pervez Hoodbhoy said might grow over the next 30 years does not necessarily lead to pro-China, and particularly over that issue of Taiwan, which could become a pivotal global issue. There are other questions about American weapons going to Taiwan when there's human rights repression going on there. That key one from Prashant Kumar: can the US secure an insecure state? And then what next for erstwhile allies? When we finish Barry Gardiner's address, I'm going to go around the whole panel to get you to, in a nutshell, sum up all of those issues. But for now, over to Barry Gardiner.
As you listen to this, I am on a flight to Montreal for the Convention on Biological Diversity. Pre-recording the summing up of a discussion like the one you've just had means I have to be Nostradamus or Mystic Meg. I claim to be neither. So forgive me if I don't capture the essence of the distinguished speakers, but I hope it might be interesting to see whether my perceptions of the changing relationship between the US and Pakistan have echoes in the eminent speakers that you've just heard. Long before the coalition in 2001 pushed them from power, Pakistan had supported the Taliban overtly, and it has to be said, covertly. General Musharraf had in effect played a double game, outwardly supportive of the US coalition, but harboring terrorists in training camps in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and using them to incite cross-border insurgency and terrorist sorties into India. So, 20 years on, the Taliban's ultimate victory in Afghanistan and the withdrawal of the United States forces from the country after those 2 decades has reshaped the strategic landscape of the region. Although some accused Pakistan of smirking that the Taliban had finally achieved the withdrawal of the coalition forces, the truth is that any kudos they might have hoped for as a result of their role in brokering the peace deal between the Ashraf Ghani regime and the Taliban has foundered on the chaotic end of days scenario where the Americans left in a disorderly chaos that saw them leave behind military equipment estimated to be worth more than $10 billion. That rather put a dampener on any diplomatic uplift Pakistan might have hoped for. August 2021 changed Islamabad's relationship with Washington. Senior US officials went public in saying Pakistan should have asserted more influence on the Taliban to reach a negotiated peace settlement. Their conclusion was that the relationship with Pakistan should be downgraded, a conclusion that was somewhat strengthened when Khan paid a visit to Putin on the very day that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, opinion in Pakistan will tell you that this was what led to Imran Khan being ousted in the vote in April. Khan accused Donald Liu, Assistant Secretary of the US Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, of engineering the vote of no confidence when he met with the Pakistan ambassador to Washington. Millions in Pakistan certainly believe it, despite Khan having offered no evidence to substantiate the claim. But then, one would hardly expect a senior official in the US administration to leave a gingerbread trail of evidence for any interference in a foreign sovereign nation's internal affairs. Whether true or not, Khan has exposed and is playing upon the huge anti-American sentiment that exists in the country, and the US would not be sensible to ignore that. Despite the country's worst monsoon in decades and the appalling floods and loss of life that we've seen played out on our televisions, he has continued to foment popular unrest and has demonized the new coalition government. Perhaps the greatest irony is that after coming to power in 2018, only after brokering a deal with the Pakistan military and the all-powerful ISI himself, he has now accused the Pakistan army of getting involved in politics. The military is, and always has been, the key to power in Pakistan. They have a fundamental principle, which is that close ties with the United States are central to the country's geopolitical relevance. And at this point in time, they are keen to stabilize a terrible economic situation in the country and an acute liquidity crisis that's been made worse by the ravages of the devastating natural disaster. One of the first measures taken by the Shehbaz Sharif-led coalition was to overturn Khan's unfunded fuel and electricity subsidies. This was so Pakistan could resume negotiations with the International Monetary Fund following a 7-month hiatus over a $6.5 billion program to try and get the economy back on track. Now, there are signs too that the Biden administration is softening its line. In addition to the resumption of the IMF program, State Department Counselor Delek Cholet announced a 10-day humanitarian air bridge to Pakistan in response to the floods and a $30 million relief package. In fact, that package has ultimately been upwards of $80 million. And this was followed by a strategically timed visit by Samantha Power, the administrator of US aid, who took the time to field questions at a press conference in Islamabad to Pakistani journalists. And even though the pretext for the two visits was largely humanitarian in nature, both officials spoke about the significance of the 75 years of bilateral relations between the two countries, as well as the importance of deepening ties. And recollecting that the Trump administration had previously ended the technological and technical support program for Pakistan in 2018, few would count it a coincidence that at the same time, the State Department announced the approval of the potential sale of F-16 aircraft sustainment program to Pakistan in a deal valued at up to $450 million, purportedly for the servicing of joint counterterrorism objectives. So the US-Pakistan relationship has always been based, one, on military cooperation and counterterrorism cooperation, two, strategic geopolitical influence in the region, and a very poor third, development, trade, and humanitarian investment. The US is one of Pakistan's largest sources of foreign direct investment and is Pakistan's largest export market. In 2021, the US imported more than $5 billion of Pakistani goods. US foreign direct investment into the country is now at its highest level in over a decade. The Biden administration has consistently expressed its commitment to the stability of Pakistan. Nevertheless, it seems to be reviewing the historic foundations of the relationship. Meetings with American and Indian leaders, the establishment of new partnerships, and the heavy emphasis of US-Indian cooperation in the national security strategies, both in 2021 and 22, point to a shift in security collaboration from Pakistan towards India. The US seems like it will maintain security cooperation with Pakistan to the extent it serves its interests, but will probably emphasize more collaboration with other partners in the area. Development and humanitarian investment, both public and private, has increased and will remain a central part of the relationship. This could be a response, though, to the growing relationship between China and Pakistan. The US will remain committed to Pakistan under Biden, but it seems there will be significantly less direct security collaboration after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, points to ponder. First, there is an increased level of cooperation with India in the security space. The national security strategies of 21 and 22 include no reference to Pakistan, but emphasize the US-India relationship quite a bit. Second, Biden's engagement with India, particularly in relation to the war in Ukraine and the establishment of the new strategic partnerships, such as the Quad and the I2U2. Third, don't forget that China has invested aggressively in Pakistan through the CPEC corridor, and 2021, the PRC became Pakistan's #1 source of new foreign direct investment. US companies have pledged more than $1.5 billion in investment in Pakistan, but I think the US will be looking very carefully at how the relationship between China and Pakistan develops. And fourth, Pakistani airspace was reportedly used by a US drone which killed Al-Qaeda Ayman al-Zawahiri this year. That most likely came from the formal agreement between the US and Pakistan to allow the use of Pakistani airspace. So, in terms of military, in terms of economic cooperation, this is not going to come to an end, but it does seem that the US will have it under close review, and Pakistan may not be the useful ally that it used to be. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I think you captured, as a fellow panelist, almost what we were discussing before. I would like to go around very quickly now to each of the panelists backwards. I think on just to sum up, what next? And I think Prashant Kumar's question: can the US secure an insecure state? If you could wrap that up in just a few seconds of thought to give us your final conclusions for the debate. Julian Spencer-Churchill.
Yeah, Pakistan is not unstable. If you were to measure it against other large countries in the international system, it's got a very stable military institution that's able to make consistent promises. And it has a democratic society that makes Pakistan an automatic ally because of the societal norms and the free press with other democracies, and it's not really negotiable. The idea that Pakistan is unstable, if compared even to Mexico, the U.S. neighbor, is largely the result of sort of exaggerated rhetoric. One of the key levers against Pakistan is this constant discussion of terrorism, and that Pakistan is a sponsor of terrorism. But if you look at the U.S. operations in Afghanistan, there was never any serious thought about going in to deal with the sanctuaries within Pakistan because of the American memory of the failure of intervention in Laos during the Vietnam War. Terrorism is local. The U.S. failure and the NATO's failure in Afghanistan is entirely its own. So it really is this rhetoric of instability, which is inaccurate.
Okay, so thank you very much. So Pakistan is a stable democratic ally. Mariam, Mufti, your thoughts?
Right. So I do think that the US-Pakistan relationship can improve. And like I said in my talk, I don't necessarily think that it has to be just in the realm of security. It can also be in entrepreneurship, expanding people-to-people ties. I think the United States may need to move away from its typical way of aiding the Pakistani states through military-to-military transfers, or even government-to-military transfers, or government-to-government transfers. I think now the United States should consider expanding its people-to-people contact in Pakistan. And I think that would really boost the relationship as well. I don't think all is lost. I do think that the United States can reevaluate and improve the situation in South Asia by keeping Pakistan, a little bit on its side. I think allowing Pakistan to fall into the hands of, say, the Russians, the Chinese, or the Saudi Arabians is not necessarily a smart move on the US's part. And I think not all is lost. I think there are ways to move forward.
So it has got a good chance of securing an insecure state. And what next? More people to people. Ayesha, Siddiqa.
Well, I agree that not everything is lost, but let me say that people to people doesn't work for Pakistan and the United States. I mean, I'm reminded that I remember visiting the US after 9/11, and where I discovered that, when 9/11 happened, there were a lot of Pakistanis who were caught in the United States because they were calling each other, congratulating each other. So it's not just that they're all, and they were not all fundamentalists, by the way. I think there is an anti-colonialism which is also kind of part of this anti-Americanism or this anti-American discourse. Now, having said that, let me, so I don't think that people.
I have to. We're right up against time, so can I just?
Yeah,
ask
just very
2 seconds. Yes, okay.
Yeah, 2 seconds. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that I don't think that with the Pakistan-China relationship, America considers that everything is lost. In fact, what General Bajwa has done very recently is that he has balanced that relationship. And in fact, in Gwadar and in Balochistan, China is being pushed back. The soft power of Western forces is working much more to American advantage than to China's.
Okay, so it is more stable and more of an ally than possibly we think, and has got a chance of becoming more of one. Wajid, Syed, you started us off, you finish us off.
Thank you. I think whatever is happening right now with US and Pakistan, I think that's that's United States on behalf of United States effort to again engage with Pakistan. So I agree that all is not lost. I think that's the understanding over here as well. Whatever happened in the past, it was very bad. We're not going to trust them, but we have interest in the region as well. But we are not going to rely on Pakistan as well. But then we are going to engage so that we could have some sort of understanding what is going on and how to divert if need to be. What needs to happen is that the Pakistani establishment and the elite need to understand that when they propagate this anti-Americanism or anti-Westernism, I was reading some declassified documents. Starting from the beginning, there was this Messiah sort of thing in these military establishment and the elite that the West wants to undo Pakistan. Even right now, and they would say that we want to keep it together and we are going to face this propaganda against Pakistan. Even now that the foreign minister, the finance minister who was here to secure the IMF deal is now saying that we are not going to bow down to these conditions that IMF is offering us, and we are going to react to that. So Pakistan needs to actually understand that people-to-people contact, there were efforts made by the US in the past, even now, this is from the Pakistani perspective that they need to understand this, that this American anti-Americanism would not work anymore, because every time you come to the Western world or the Americans and then say, see, there's this going on against you and we need to counter that, so help us out with this sentiment.
So what next, I think, sums it up, more understanding between the two to close the ranks there. A lot to discuss. Thank you so much, everybody. We are beyond time. Time's winged chariot has passed us by, but we've really plowed through some really insightful ground today. So thank you, Wajid, Syed, Ayesha, Siddiqa, Pervez, Hoodbhoy, Mariam, Mufti, and Julian, Spencer-Churchill, for your thoughts and for dealing with the audience's comments and questions. Thank you for those comments and questions. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the contributions. Please I'll just get this, and look at our sister publication, Asian Affairs, because it delves deeply into the sort of Asian issues that you don't get in the mainstream press. Keep your eye out for our New Year Democracy Forum debate schedule, where after COVID, we hope again to start having in-person sessions as well as these Zoom fit sessions. But until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, our best wishes for the holiday season and for the new year. Stay safe, stay involved, stay curious, and see you all soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.